All right, welcome everybody. Stacey Murphy here. And the reason I'm hosting this is that right now I'm very interested in what blockchain technology can do for systems. And back in 2010, we started a couple technology projects that I didn't realize were blockchain at the time. And so I wanted to share our experiences in 2010 as lessons learned and how blockchain could be used in systems integration and holistic design. Specifically, I'll be talking about the food system in this presentation because that's what we were doing. So first, I want to share with you the system that we were working on in 2010, and then I'll share with you how we were going to apply the technology and what challenges we ran into and what questions we had. And then from there, we'll go into questions. So back in 2010, or actually 2009, I was asking the question, what would the metabolism of a healthy farming ecosystem look like, especially in our cities, and how would we measure it? And so why that was important to me was that I was thinking about 20% of fossil fuel consumption goes to food system. This was in 2010, these are stats. 22% of all of our healthcare dollars in the United States was treating chronic and food-related diseases. This has definitely gone up. And 20% of greenhouse gases comes from food systems. Because that greenhouse gas, which is contributing to climate change, 20%, and that number is from 2010, comes from the food system because a lot of the food, the problem with the food system, especially in the United States, is that the food's being lost in distribution. So packaging, processing, transporting, the shelves of the grocery stores, all of that combined is 40% loss of the fresh food. So not necessarily of like our grains and those sorts of things, but our fresh food. And then there is another, let me move this over here. And then there is another 40% that gets lost in the fridge. So you know it, I know it, we have the best intentions, we buy our food and then like basically it gets lost in the bottom of our fridge and it goes bad. And that ends up a lot of times in the landfill. And a lot of the food that's ending up in the landfill is basically becoming greenhouse gases. It does not decompose in the landfill. So that was the issue, the problem we were trying to address back in 2010 and 2009. So another stat is we created enough food in 2010 for over 9 billion people. The population was 6 or 7 billion, but 1 billion people went hungry and lots more got sick. So the food, it's not really a food creation problem, it's a food distribution problem that we have in a lot of ways. And so BK Farmyards that we created in 2009 created a decentralized urban farming system, growing food right where people lived to eliminate the distribution issue. So we started with our first plot was in a backyard. And what's surprising about New York City is that there is 820,000 acres of private lawns in New York City, in the densest city in the United States. So we started at the kind of lowest hanging fruit. We started converting lawns to farms. And just one example, this is Foxtrot. We had 4 different types of partnerships with people. So we had partnerships with homeowners, and this was a 450 square foot of growing space. It fed 6 CSA members for 35 weeks of the year. We had a total of 60 to 100 pounds of fresh produce coming out of this site each week. So we started with partnerships with homeowners, but then we quickly ramped up to other plots of unused land. So we're basically creating BK Farmyards. The idea was that we were co-creating the foodscape with the community, with the eaters and the producers. Everybody was becoming co-creators of the foodscape. And so we partnered with local organizations that had land, all the community gardens. So this was one example, Fort Hen. We had 100 chickens with an intern program, workshops, and a 40-person CSA. We partnered with schools. This was a 1-acre youth farm that we had, and it was at the High School for Public Service. We had the farmers market, the CSA, New York City Farm School was hosted here. So all of New York City had a farm school that was hosted here. We had youth programs, we had it all. And these youth, also important to note is that this land was where there was no fresh food. So you could walk 20 minutes from this farm in any direction and you would not find a single grocery store, and the bodegas did not have any fresh food or vegetables. They had all junk food. So we were basically positioning ourselves in places where there was a lack of fresh food. And then we partnered with developers. This was a project where we had a farmer in residence. It was a new multi-use building with a cafe, a farm, and a composting facility. And a farmer was basically given a free place to live in order to do those services. So why am I talking about all of this coming from blockchain perspective? So the data that we did know is that the amount of food that we lost in distribution was 0%. So we were doing good. The problem that we saw was a distribution problem. We were definitely solving that. The food was being distributed. We had acres of land. We were feeding thousands of people. We were growing food and flowers for hundreds of people, servicing weddings, servicing 50 local restaurants. We were employing 6 full-time farmers, training interns, employing youth farmers, keeping them off the streets. These were gang-related areas. We were leading hundreds of teens through leadership programs. We had a Go Green food systems curriculum that we were teaching thousands of people in New York City. We had corporate wellness days where employees of places like Wells Fargo and Chase would come out and have a day on the farm. We were improving the soil's water carrying capacity, which is important for our planet and for greenhouse gases. We were remediating toxic lead from backyard sites and more. So this was what we knew to be true. And then I will say this, in terms of blockchain, we're always thinking about what are the currencies. So blockchain is all about how do you value exchange, right? So just as one example of this, when you look at Fort Hen and you look at our 100 chickens, we were basically repurposing 80 gallons of 6 Point, that's a brewery. We would get their spent grain and we would bring it, and that's what the chickens would eat. There was Stumptown was a coffee roastery, and we would use their chaff in order to create the bedding for the chickens. And so we were repurposing materials that would otherwise go to the landfill. 30 gallons of harvested rainwater for those chickens. All of the egg cartons were donated and reused. So basically, we were creating a food system out of nothing. We were creating a food system out of waste of the city. And this was a huge value for the city. If you imagine what this is worth to the city, a lot of materials not going to the landfill and being turned into real food for the community, and education for the community about how their food is grown and what to do with their food. So we also started the currencies were not just materials being moved around the city, but also between our sites, the chickens would donate their services to other sites. So our chickens would go travel to our other farms and they would tear out the grass and they would deposit precious fertilizer. So all of these different exchanges were a part of the system. And here's what we didn't know. We didn't know how many cubic yards of compost we were creating. We were creating a lot, but we didn't have a record of it all. We were redirecting tons of lawn and food scraps from the landfill, but we didn't know exactly how much. We were increasing access to fresh food in underserved populations, but we didn't know by how much. We were sequestering carbon, which is important to climate change, but we didn't know how much. We were reducing landfill methane emissions, reducing obesity and chronic diet-related diseases, reducing dollars spent on healthcare. We were reducing fossil fuel consumption of the system by a certain percentage, but we didn't know how much. Most of our transportation was by bike. Reducing distribution of waste, we didn't know by how much, and reducing household grocery waste, we weren't sure. So we knew we were benefiting a lot of things, but we weren't sure exactly how much. And so in 2010, I proposed Farm Share, and I submitted it to the Buckminster Fuller Institute. It was a finalist in their challenge. And basically the idea was it was a way to verify the value of all of these decentralized resources that we were using. The people, the conversations were very important that we were having on Twitter, the resources that we were repurposing, and so much more. So we thought of this idea of Farm Share, which would basically spatialize. We were going to use all of our tools that we use: Facebook, Google Calendar, Twitter, maps, Craigslist, and physical resources of the city. And it was a way to create a system where we could measure the output of everything we were doing combined so that we could go back to the mayor. Because we went to the mayor in 2010 or 2011, and we did get installed a mayoral task force for urban food, urban farming, basically, and we made a lot of change in the city. We helped legislation allow greenhouses on the top of buildings, which wasn't legally permitted previously because people were misusing that as part of their houses. So we changed legislation, but the mayor said to us, we said, we're doing a service to you. We're repurposing all of these materials. We're doing a service for you. Please help us with the resources that we need, which is more land. We were looking at the time, looking at Central Park as another farm. We were looking at some other ideas. We said, we would love resources. And he said, prove to us how valuable you are, and we will give you resources. And so I came up with this idea where there would be different tabs on our website that would be borrow, find, help, food, farms, and events. And each person in the network could help in any one of those different ways. So when you opened up your portal, and let's say this was Lee, that's my image, but let's say your name was Lee and you had this site, this mobile farming site on vacant land, and this would be a record of how many people helped you find resources, what resources you've borrowed from people, like tools were one of the things that we borrowed from site to site, volunteers that would come out and help, the amount of food that you were delivering, and it would track the resources that were being repurposed, and there would be data for that. So this was the idea that we submitted, and the idea being that a decentralized network, the value of it is in the exchange of these resources. And so we were looking for a way to incentivize those transitions and those exchanges without us being the center. So what I found very quickly is that my team, we were using all these tools, and somebody, for instance, somebody came to us, I'll just give you a little example here. So somebody would come to us and they would say, I want to help. BK Farmyards, you're doing an amazing job. You're doing a lot of cool stuff. I want to help. And we would say, what do you have to, what resources do you have? And this one guy, Bob, he was like, I got a truck and I got 2 hours of time. And we were like, cool. So basically, when you go back to this Fort Hen currency exchange, we said, Bob, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to go to the chicken coop, pick up 3 dozen eggs. Then we want you to take one of those dozen eggs over to Six Point, the brewery, and you're going to pick up 80 gallons of spent grain and put it in your car. And you're going to give them 1 dozen eggs for that exchange of what they shared with us. And by the way, that brewer is really nice, and he'll probably give you a little bit of beer that'll be like a special, like something he's working on that day. And so then he would exchange those goods. Then we would say, okay, drive another half mile, go to the coffee roaster, pick up the spent grain or the coffee chaff, which is everything we need for bedding for our chickens for the week, and also for our compost for the week, and drop off a dozen eggs for them, tell them that make sure that they hold on to their chaff instead of throwing it away, hold on to it for us specifically, and exchange that dozen eggs. And then, by the way, they're nice people. They'll probably give you a little bag of roasted coffee. And then he would come back to the hen house and he would deliver the food and the bedding for the chickens. And he would go home with his 1 dozen eggs that's left, his beer and his coffee. Everybody wins, right? And so we would incentivize people for these win-win situations. But what we found is that we got to a place where we maximized our ability. We had spreadsheets and all kinds of Google calendars for people to plug into. But we found that we were just running on empty, trying to keep up with the thousands of people that were helping us. And so the idea was to allow the tech to do it. And so this idea was basically you would go to different tabs, and also what would happen is you would go to the Find tab, and all the resources that people would have available would be on a map. So you could say, hey, I got a farm, I'm a block away from here, or I got a garden, I'm a block away from here. I'm going to come pick that up on my bike and bring it back. And so, and then the idea was we could track all of these interactions, and we could track the amount of resources that we had repurposed, and then convert that back to numbers for the mayor and say, we just saved you X amount on landfill. We just saved you X amount on transporting waste. And we could also potentially, if this were to scale out, we could even track people's health potentially as a way to look at health services as well. But we were just mostly focused on the resources of the city. So that is what we, this is what we were up to. And what was interesting was that in the system, there was absolutely no waste of the food. So all the food went somewhere. There was no waste in packaging, processing, grocery stores. There may have been waste on the consumer side. When they received the food, did they use it all? We don't know the answer to that because we weren't able to track it. So we also were repurposing waste from the city that would have otherwise gone to the landfill. So we're helping the city in a lot of ways too. So some of the blockchain lessons that we learned in this process, and then I'll turn it over to you guys for discussion and questions, and how else could you see this used? So one of the things that I learned is that please, please, please do not dumb down your vision when you're ahead of your times. So I was way ahead of my times on this presentation, on this technology. And when I would talk to people about it, they were excited about it, but nobody knew how to do it. And I kind of gave up. And so if you are, let's say right now, 10 years ahead of your vision, or 5 years or 2 years, don't dumb it down, just keep talking it into being. I feel like we could have made massive progress on BK Farmyards. BK Farmyards got to a level, and then it just stopped growing because I stopped putting my energy into this technological solution. And then the systems that were there just did their thing and just stayed resilient over time because we had built them to be resilient without the person at the top. But without some kind of technology for this thing to really scale, it doesn't ever get bigger. So the other thing I realized is that blockchain is really ideally suited to create efficiency in logistics projects. And with the tech that we would have had to link all these resources together, we would have been so efficient. If we had maps of where everything was located, people were hungry for homegrown food, and we could repurpose so many resources once we knew they were there. So we spent most of our time looking for the resources and asking for the resources versus just going and picking them up. Proof of work, which is what would have been really valuable for the city, to allow them to see what value that we had in their city, so that they could have appropriated some budget for us, or maybe not even budget, but some resources for us, because we were mostly just looking for turning waste products into farm products. So if we were able to do that proof of work and get the data, we could have gotten a lot more resources from the city. And then the biggest lesson that I learned in this whole process, and this is why I'm writing a book right now, is what you think is valuable may be an illusion. And it's important to think about, what does nature find valuable? And what nature finds most valuable is the exchange. It is the giving and sharing. It is not the actual asset that is valuable. So many people look at BK Farmyards and they asked us, how much land do you have? And they were trying to value us as a business by how much land we had. But I was saying, no, BK Farmyards is not land. It is a decentralized urban farming network. And the value is in the network. It is in the ecosystem. And what nature finds valuable is the giving and sharing. And that's where we start to tokenize all of this and incentivize that giving and sharing. If we were to take farm share, and if we were to give people tokens for all of these different things that they're giving and sharing, and those tokens are worth something at the farmers markets, then all of this is an interrelated loop, essentially. So land is valuable, while food is valuable, what is even more valuable is the number of microorganisms, the number of water molecules, the number of air particles that have exchanged energy in order for that food to be grown. And if we're going to have a resilient financial system, it's going to be based on that and not on physical assets, not on a linear system. So our current financial system is a very linear system. Tokenization allows circular systems, which is essentially what nature does as well. Okay, and then hubs and spokes. So what we found in general with our decentralized system is that the youth farm was a hub of so much energy, because the youth farm was a 1 acre site, and everybody that was coming and going, there was like hundreds of thousands of people that were coming and going and adding value to this site. Whereas a backyard, like Foxtrot, the first backyard, had a smaller ecosystem. It had a smaller set of hubs and spokes. And same thing with the Fort Hen, it had a smaller system of hubs and spokes, but they were all related. And so it's important on the blockchain to recognize that there will be areas where there will be expansions of a lot of activity, and then other areas which will look smaller, but that doesn't make them any less valuable for how small they are. It just means that there's less connections maybe, but it doesn't make them any less valuable to the whole. And then true decentralization is more resilient, because that's what nature is. It favors evolution. It favors change over time, growth and learning. And so the trick is, where do you draw the boundary? So with BK Farmyards, it was really hard to draw the boundary, and to the point where we were so successful with BK Farmyards in the news that I would receive an email that said, "Congratulations on your new farm." And I would say, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And then I would look in the news, and we would have a new farm in a part of town that I had never been in. Because we were a decentralized community, we talked about how to use our name, how the system worked, and we brought people on board no matter what. And so all of a sudden, people would start a farm and call it a BK Farmyards site, and they would benefit from the whole system, and we would benefit from them joining the system. So it's really interesting. The boundary of a decentralized system is always shape shifting, and nature, it's like the minute you try to draw a connection between different things and then put a boundary, quickly you're like, oops, I have to go outside of that. Like if you try to draw a boundary around your body, all of a sudden you say, well, these are my cells, but I'm breathing right now. And this oxygen I'm breathing, 50% of it was created by phytoplankton in the ocean. So now I'm the ocean too. I'm phytoplankton. And the other 50% was created by plants. So now I'm plants too. Oh, and by the way, so you start to, in nature, it's hard to find a boundary. So with decentralized system, it'll be interesting to see how all of that unfolds. And finally, just talking it into being. I think you guys are really good at all of that, at talking things into being. So that is an overview of BK Farmyards, our decentralized urban farming network, the value that we created for the city, and the blockchain lessons that we learned from the process. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I would love to hear from all of you.